Moyers on his show on PBS, Bill Moyers Journal. Bill Moyers here today on Democracy Now! Bill, were you surprised you got the first interview with Jeremiah Wright after all of the controversy, after he'd been quiet for weeks? Were you surprised when Senator Obama denounced him?
No, because between my interview and Obama's press conference, Jeremiah Wright had, as I said in that commentary, left Obama no choice because of the way the momentum in had been driven by the press and by the partisans and by opponents. Nobody stopped to put all of this into context. So I wasn't surprised. You know, we are accustomed in politics to seeing candidates having to jettison some of their closest supporters. Lyndon Johnson had to do that to the single man who was more responsible for his longtime success than anyone else when he was arrested in 1964 in a men's room in Washington. This aide had to be let go by Lyndon Johnson in a public statement, grieved LBJ for the rest of his life. But no, you know, people have written me since all of this and said, how do you explain that a man so reasonable in conversation on Friday night could on Sunday at the NAACP and Monday at the National Press Corps be so angry? And I had to say, I'm not a psychologist. I don't know. I know that, look, Jeremiah Wright was in this church for 36 years. I'd never met him. I belong to the United Church of Christ denomination, but I never heard of Jeremiah Wright. He was a local pastor. That was his calling. That was his commitment. That was his passion. If Obama had not been in his congregation, we'd never have heard of Jeremiah Wright. But someone figured out, Christian Century Magazine figured out that over 36 years on the 11 o'clock Sunday morning services, he had preached 207,711 minutes. And the sound bites that were being looped throughout the mainstream media and the right-wing media were 16 to 20 seconds. How would you like for your long career in journalism as a broadcaster to be summed up at the end in 16 to 20 seconds? I understand that anger, that frustration that was driving him to finally want to speak. I wanted to have him on my program because I was curious myself, who is this man? I'd never met him, although I'd been a member of that same fellowship for 40 years. I tried to put him in context. We did a piece about his church, trying to show the outreach, the ministry of his church. We dealt with black liberation theology, which is the view, simply put, that people interpret the scriptures through the experience of the oppressed, not the people on top of the slave ship, as Jeremiah Wright said, but the people in the hold of the slave ship. And it was a reasonable, interesting, revealing conversation. I'm not a very adversarial fellow. I'm not a gotcha kind of journalist. Mike Wallace can do that much better than I can. And it was a very reasonable interview. But I think that the pent-up frustration of how he was being treated in the mainstream media and the fact that he was being taken out of context. The remark about chickens come home to roost, he wasn't saying that 9/11 was done because, as Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson said, because God wanted it to happen, but that there are consequences to actions. The remark about HIV, I didn't get to ask him that on the show. We ran out of time. But, you know, in the black community, where I've reported, done documentaries on black churches, black community organizers, in the black community, they're still haunted by the fact that, what is a historical fact, that the United States government let black men at Tuskegee Institute think they were being treated for syphilis when they were being allowed to die for a scientific test. That anger has been building up. I understand that. It's unfortunate it gets in the mainstream media, and Obama has to do what he did.
On the interview, the PBS ombudsman commented about it. He wrote a column critical of your questioning. Michael Gettler wrote, "There were not enough questions asked, and some that were asked came across as too reserved and too soft, considering the volatility of the churches." Statements that Moyers himself laid out at the top of the program went largely unchallenged. Those that did come up didn't really get addressed until well into the hour-long program. Your response to that?
Well, that's true. I didn't get to ask all the questions I wanted to ask. It was a 40-minute interview, and I was much more interested. I knew what was going to happen when he went to the National Press Club on Monday morning. I knew that they were going to be asking all of these questions. I leave that to those people whose job it is for the commercial media.
Did you go to Wright, or did Wright come to you to do the interview? What
happened was a group of several African-American ministers called me after all this broke And they said, you know, is it possible on your show to have a discussion of black liberation theology? And my answer was, you know, we can, of course, but that won't do any good until Reverend Wright speaks for himself. Unless we hear from him, see who he is, what he thinks, where he's coming from, then what the rest of us do might be interesting and he might be positive, but it won't answer the questions. So I said to them, Reverend Wright should speak, and if he wants to come on my broadcast, I'll give the whole broadcast to it. Well, he was on vacation at that time, a long planned trip to Africa. The moment he got back, I got a call from his church's communications person saying he'd like to do it.
What did you think of the ABC debate in Pennsylvania with the news anchors going for the first 45 minutes, really going at Obama around issues, everything from pastors to pins, lapel pins?
I thought it was a great exercise in irrelevance. Going back to one of your earlier questions, we rarely probe these candidates on what they would do about the fundamental systemic issues facing America. It has become a horse race in the media and on the campaign. That's inevitable in some respects, but I was really sad to see our craft reduced to that kind of petty and parochial concerns. These debates, moderated, mediated by the press, have really become about the press. The Sunday morning talk shows are all about themselves. They're not really about what's happening. They're not trying to help the people in Dubuque or Dallas or Des Moines get an understanding of the candidates. On
the issue of broadcasting and media, you are broadcasting on PBS. Do you think it has become, well, let's say, to put it mildly, risk-averse? Go back 40 years to the Carnegie Commission and the founding of public broadcasting. You were there in the White House. You were the press secretary for Lyndon Johnson. You came in '63 when he came in after Kennedy's assassination.
Yes, the first 2 years I was his general assistant and the fellow who was coordinating his domestic policy. I actually helped put together the task force that led to the creation of public broadcasting in 1960, Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. I had left in January of '67, but my first job, before he insisted, after 3 times I'd said no, he insisted I become the press secretary, was dealing with issues like the environment, the civil rights, public broadcasting, and all of that. So, yes, I was present at the creation, and I have to say that public broadcasting today is not the adventuresome, the risk-taking exercise in diversity and pluralism and democracy that we had hoped it would be. It lacks the financial independence to take the risks that you can only take when you have nothing to lose. Because 17% of public broadcasting funding comes from Congress, that makes it political in the eyes of many people, even though that influence is marginal. No, you know, I've advocated for years publicly that Democracy Now! Should be on public broadcasting.
And it is on a number of
stations, but it's not fed through the system. It's not a system-wide. It should be, and there should be other reasonable voices with different philosophies than yours and mine on the air, but it is hamstrung by financial penury, and it's embedded in a system that is altogether too political, and so it doesn't take the risk that we ought to be taking. We ought to be the forum for the country.
What do you think of Kenneth Tomlinson, the man who made you his target, possibly drove you off PBS for a while, giving $5 million to the Wall Street Journal report that aired on PBS, $5 million. Now it goes to Fox, so PBS becomes the incubator for programs in the commercial media.
Well, I addressed that story in 2 of the speeches I delivered that are published in Moyers on democracy. They didn't drive me off the air. PBS stood behind me. Pat Mitchell, the then president of PBS, was under enormous pressure. I wasn't even aware of how much pressure until I left. The main reason I left, I had been doing this weekly broadcast. I was 70 years old. I was tired. I needed a rest. But the main reason I left is that I could not oppose. I knew what Kenneth Tomlinson who was Carl Rove's man at the Corporation for Public Broadcast. I knew what they were doing. I had friends still working at CPB. One of them called me and said, you know, Tomlinson has said his job is to get rid of Moyers. Well, I wasn't going to let that happen. But I finally realized that the only way I could deal with Kenneth Tomlinson and the right-wing effort to intimidate public broadcasting was to leave the air. for a while because I couldn't use my broadcast. I couldn't use the camera to oppose him because it would appear to be self-serving. So I left. I retired at the age of 70, went out and made a series of speeches. Most of them are in that book. 2 of them dealt directly with Tomlinson. And I worked with friends of public broadcasting in Washington to tell the story of what was happening. As a result of that and other things, the integrity of the Inspector General of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting looked into Tomlinson's activities and decided they were violating the rules and the regulations. He had to leave the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. He was not reappointed. And then he had to also leave the board of the governors of